Okay, I'm gonna try it. Welcome to ImplementED, an education conference exploring how to implement social and emotional learning programs at scale. My name is Mariah O'Mara, and I am the head of communications at global education nonprofit HundrED, and I will be your host for the day. We are living through a time of converging crises with the global coronavirus pandemic, political instability, climate change, rising inequality, and an information revolution that is changing the very nature of life and work around us. Policymakers have an essential role in navigating these challenges. Education reform should be focused on developing young people's capacity to truly deal with these global challenges. In today's program, we are going to demonstrate how investing in social and emotional learning programs can do just that, helping children to flourish in life, no matter what happens. With the generous support of our partners at the Labhya Foundation, we are going to share concrete examples of how social and emotional learning, or SEL, programs have been implemented at scale in different contexts, explore various implementation strategies, and discuss the latest research on how the systemic integration of SEL programs in formal education can lead to improved learning outcomes and well-being in students and communities at large. You will hear from innovators and policymakers from around the world. They will explain how they were able to implement SEL programs nationally, and we will explore the results together and share some of the findings from our first ever policy report. This is the second and final video in our SEL series. If you're interested in catching up on the first video, you can find the link in the description below. There, we discuss our social and emotional learning spotlight report. In that report, we defined social and emotional learning as the process through which all children and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes they need to develop healthy identities, manage their emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, and establish and maintain supportive relationships and make responsible, caring decisions. More importantly, we identified 13 impactful and scalable education innovations across 10 countries. These innovations highlight the focus currently being placed on social and emotional learning as an essential aspect of child development. You are going to hear from some of these innovators a little later on today, but we want to give you a look at all of these innovations. So, to kick off today's program, we are going to start with a short video to introduce these innovations to you. As you can see, the 13 selected innovations from our SEL Spotlight address social and emotional learning using a variety of different methods. You can find more information on all of these innovations in our Social and Emotional Learning Spotlight report. which is available to download for free on the HundrED website and linked in the video description. In addition, we have just released a new SEL series which explores each of these innovations in depth. Next, we are going to hear from Anneli Rautiainen, Head of Innovation Unit at the Finnish National Agency for Education, on her experience implementing social and emotional learning programs in Finland. In the next session, she sits down with our Executive Director, Lasse Leponiemi. Over to you, Lasse.
Thank you, Mariah. My name is Lasse Leponiemi. I'm the Executive Director at HundrED. It's my pleasure to interview Anneli Rautiainen, Senior Expert in Education at the Finnish National Agency for Education. Previously, she has been working extensively with implementing and experimenting different kinds of educational innovations in Finnish primary and secondary schools. Today, we are going to discuss on her experience implementing social and emotional learning practices and solutions across the Finnish primary schools. Previously, when you were the head of the Innovation Experimenting Center at the Finnish National Agency for Education, you were trying out different kind of solution practices within the different primary schools here in Finland. How do you see that this kind of experimenting can support policy making and implementing new solutions to the system?
It's very important that we also have a bottom-up approach, because traditionally the administrative approach is from top down. And we don't always know at the government level what the exact problems are at the grassroots level in schools. So the teachers, the students, the parents and the principals know best. So that's why we were trying to encourage the schools to come up with a solution to a problem that they had defined. It could have been social emotional learning, it could have been something to do about pedagogy of IT and so on. So this was a great experience to see how change can be made both from top down and bottom up.
And now, during these times of big worldwide events and recovering from the pandemic, we are often hearing that we should be paying more attention to resilience, we should be understanding the social and emotional competencies that the student need in order to thrive in their life. How do you see that the Finnish education system has been reacting to these demands and needs we are seeing around us?
Well, there are great examples in different cities what they have done. For example, there's a city of Rovesi in Finland, and they wanted to enhance the social emotional learning in their school, where first it was a teacher's approach to have a sort of a place in school where they could practice different emotions. But students were not very keen on going there. Whereas they gave the ownership of the innovation to the students. And once the students started to run the experiment, it actually became very popular within the school. And now they have hired a social emotional coach to help the teachers also to understand what it requires to have a pedagogy that supports social emotional learning.
Often when we are discussing about the Finnish education system around the world, people are mentioning that teachers have a lot of pedagogical freedom. But then something that is not that often mentioned is that the students are also very much empowered and they are an active member of the school community and the learning community within the school. How do you think that the combination of this pedagogical freedom of the teachers and then engaged students can be complementing the implementation of social emotional learning skills as a part of the curriculum?
Well, student participation is very important. Student needs to have ownership of his or her own learning. And a teacher is a facilitator who enables them to learn. So teacher is no longer the center of all knowledge or the center of all learning. it is the student. So giving more freedom to students to participate and discover and innovate is the key, really, for them to become good problem solvers, collaboration increases, and also empathy.
As a part of this ImplementED webinar, we are interviewing different policymakers around the world. And you have been involved in the policymaking in the Finnish context for a longer period of time. So how do you see that through the policymaking we can support schools to implement social and emotional learning skills or competencies, or some other skills and competencies we see as an important part of the future of education?
Well, first of all, we need to see where the need is. And we have to be very sensitive to the signals that we hear and see at schools. We must listen to the teachers, we must listen to the parents, we must listen to the students, and then start acting on that. Because if we are making decisions top-down only at the government level and scaling it down, we might not have the right skills to teach, or we don't see the need, what is accurate at the moment. So that's why we have to have good interaction between all the players of the system, and then work together, both bottom up and top down. And also ask the students, what do they need now? What kind of skills they would think that they would need. We know the working life requires a lot of collaboration, for example, and the daily life with peers and families require empathy. So we need to build trust and all these skills together for the benefit of our students, the young people who are the future makers of this world.
You have been mentioning collaboration and empathy as a very important part of social and emotional learning skills and competencies. If you would need to mention one more thing you would hope to see implemented in the Finnish education system in the near future, what would that be?
Yes, I would say innovation and curiosity, because we already know that our society is built on trust, and we have been trying to experiment how to best do problem solving. But on top of that, we need innovations, and we also need curiosity to discover the problems that we see around us and see how we can collaboratively start solving them together.
That's beautiful, and we can clearly see that the collaboration is one of the key ingredients in the Finnish education system. If you would give one advice to other policymakers around the world how to implement social and emotional learning skills and competencies within their system, what would that be?
I think we have to be one learning community together. The learning community at school and at the administration as well, so that we have good interaction, we communicate together, and we try to find solutions together to the existing problems and celebrate together after we have discovered something new.
Thank you so much, Anneli, for this interview. And I hope you found all of these great answers very insightful. And now back to you, Marija.
Thank you so much, Anneli and Lasse, for that stimulating discussion. Next, we are going to hear from one of our selected innovators, Richa Gupta, co-founder of the Labhya Foundation, based out of India. The Labhya Foundation partners with governments to co-create scalable and localized SEL programs for vulnerable children across public education systems. Labhya provides end-to-end support through the co-creation of curriculum, teacher capacity building, monitoring and evaluation, and support in effective implementation. In this next session, Richa sits down with Manish Sisodia, the Deputy Chief Minister and Education Minister of Delhi, and Arzu, a student from one of the classrooms that has been impacted by this curriculum.
Today we're in conversation with Arzu and Mr. Manish Sisodia, the Deputy Chief Minister of Delhi and the Education Minister of Delhi, the person who imagined the happiness curriculum, a daily mandated 30-minute class running across all public schools of Delhi dedicated to children's emotional well-being. The happiness curriculum helps children and enables them to become more resilient, have stronger relationships, and have higher learning motivation. Currently launched in 2018, the program runs across all 1,000 plus public schools of Delhi and is impacting more than 18 lakh children or 1.8 million children. So let's find out more about the impact of happiness, what's been going on, and what happens inside the classroom every day from Arzu and Minister Sisodia.
सर, जब आपके टाइम में ये माइंडफुलनेस, हैप्पीनेस जैसा कुछ था आपके स्कूल में?
मेरे स्कूल में नहीं था, पर जब मैं स्कूल में पढ़ता था तो मुझे मेरे पेरेंट्स ने मेडिटेशन सिखाया था. एंड आई कैन सेंस कि मेरे पेरेंट्स, मेरे फादर मेडिटेशन करते थे और उन्होंने मुझे सिखाया था और मुझे अपने अंदर कामनेस, अपनी स्ट्रेंथ, अपनी और माइंड की एनर्जी समझ में आने लगी थी. तो जब मैं एजुकेशन मिनिस्टर बना तो मुझे लगा कि जो मुझे बचपन में मिला वो सारे बच्चों को मिलना चाहिए स्कूल से. मुझे मेरे पेरेंट्स से मिला, पर फिर सारे बच्चों को मिलना चाहिए. देश में ये हमारे देश के लोगों की खोज है, हमारे देश के हज़ारों साल पुराने लोगों की खोज है. तो मेरे समय पे नहीं होता था, मतलब हैप्पीनेस क्लास नहीं होती थी, माइंडफुलनेस जैसी एक्टिविटीज़ तो बिल्कुल नहीं होती थी. नैतिक शिक्षा करके एक होती थी, मोरल स्टोरीज़, उसमें एक प्रॉब्लम होती थी, उसमें प्रीचिंग बहुत होती थी कि आपको अच्छा होना चाहिए, आपको सच बोलना चाहिए, आपको लड़ना नहीं चाहिए. पर ये तो कह दिया कि लड़ना नहीं चाहिए, पर जब भाई कुछ गड़बड़ कर देता है तो गुस्सा तो आ ही जाता है, लड़ाई तो हो जाती है. पर जब आप माइंडफुलनेस करते हो, जब आप हैप्पीनेस की तरह से अपने माइंड का, अपने थॉट्स का पूरा ऑपरेशन करके देखते हो, तब लगता है कि फिर गुस्सा नहीं आता. आप सोचो कि ऐसे ही गुस्सा नहीं आएगा, आपने कह दिया कि गुस्सा नहीं करना चाहिए, गुस्सा नहीं आएगा, ये तो होने वाला नहीं है. आदमी है यार, हम इंसान है. तो इसीलिए मुझे लगा कि प्रीचिंग से काम नहीं चलेगा, मोरल स्टोरीज़ को खाली रटा दो और उनसे 4 क्वेश्चन पूछ लो, उससे काम नहीं चलेगा. नीचे उतरना पड़ेगा, माइंड के साइंस पे उतरना पड़ेगा. तो हैप्पीनेस में हमने ये किया.
और आपको क्यों लगा कि ये हम लोगों के लिए क्यों ज़रूरत है, हैप्पीनेस क्यों ज़रूरी है हम लोगों के लिए?
इतने सारे अच्छे प्यारे प्यारे बच्चे मैं देखता हूँ स्कूलों में, आप जैसे इतने सारे बच्चे दिखाई देते हैं वहाँ पे, और फिर लगता है कितने प्यारे हैं, कितने खिलखिलाते हुए बच्चे रहते हैं, ब्राइट हैं, ब्रिलियंट हैं. लेकिन फिर मैं देखता हूँ कि ये बड़े होके मन में कूड़ा भर जाता है ना, हेट्रेट भर जाती है, टेंशन में रहते हैं, जॉब की टेंशन, आपस के प्रमोशन की टेंशन, नौकरी की टेंशन, बिजनेस की टेंशन, घर की टेंशन. तो और फिर झगड़े हैं, इतने सारे जाति के झगड़े हैं, धर्म के झगड़े हैं. मुझे अच्छा नहीं लगता था. वायलेंस है. तो मुझे लगा हर पढ़ा लिखा आदमी इसमें क्यों लगा हुआ है, तो इसका मतलब पढ़ाई में कुछ गड़बड़ है. तो मुझे वो पढ़ाई में कमी दिखाई दे रही थी. तो हमने सोचा कि हैप्पीनेस क्लास शुरू करने से, साइंस पढ़ाने से हम अच्छा साइंटिस्ट दे रहे हैं, इंजीनियरिंग पढ़ाने से हम अच्छा इंजीनियर दे रहे हैं, लेकिन आदमी हैप्पी नहीं है. हैप्पी इंजीनियर चाहिए, हैप्पी साइंटिस्ट चाहिए, इसलिए किया.
और आपके माइंड में ये आइडिया कहाँ से आया हैप्पीनेस स्टार्ट करने के लिए?
मैं बहुत सारे लोगों को देखता हूँ ना, कि दलाई लामा साहब मेरे इंस्पायरेशन हैं, गांधी जी, भगत सिंह जैसे लोग. हमेशा सोचो 23 साल का एक लड़का, जब लोग अपना कैरियर सोच रहे होते हैं, वो देश के लिए लड़ रहा था और खुशी खुशी लड़ रहा था. जान दे दी उसने अपने देश के लिए. तो खुशी में देता है आदमी जान, वो खुशी अंदर से होती है. तो हर प्रोफेशनल के अंदर, हर बंदे के अंदर कोई खुशी आनी चाहिए. तो इसीलिए हमने सोचा कि हम अपने बच्चों को मेडिटेशन सिखाएंगे. फिर मोरल स्टोरीज़ भी ज़रूरी हैं, जैसे हम सिखाते हैं भाई के नहीं लड़ाई लड़ने वाली, या भाई है बोझ नहीं है, या 3 मजदूर जैसी स्टोरीज़ हैं. तो मोरल स्टोरी भी ज़रूरी है, लेकिन उन मोरल स्टोरीज़ के पीछे जो साइंस है उसको भी समझना ज़रूरी है. तो हमें लगा कि इसको पूरे को एक पूरी क्लास का दर्जा देना चाहिए. ये ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि हम बस कुछ अच्छी कहानी सुनाएं और बच्चों को कहें अब अच्छे हो गए, या हम मेडिटेशन कराएं और बच्चों को कहें अच्छे हो गए. बच्चा, उसके मन में क्या चल रहा है, उसके अंदर क्या घटना घट रही है, उसके अंदर क्या रिएक्शंस आ रहे हैं, उन सबको देखे, ऑब्जर्व करे. तो इसलिए हमने सोचा इसको हैप्पीनेस क्लास बोलते हैं. और आज हैप्पीनेस क्लास पूरे देश में, पूरी दुनिया में पॉपुलर हो रही है, मुझे खुशी है.
रिचा दी, आप सर से कैसे मिले और आप दोनों ने मिलकर इस कार्यक्रम को कैसे आगे बढ़ाया?
थैंक यू आरजू। तो 2017 में एक बहुत ही अनोखा पब्लिक सर्कुलर न्यूज़पेपर में निकला था।
एडवर्टीजमेंट निकाला था हम लोगों ने न्यूज़पेपर में।
जी, जो बहुत ही यूनिक था, क्योंकि यूजुअली पब्लिक सर्कुलर्स में टेंडर्स और ये सब चीज़ें निकलती हैं, और एक सर्कुलर निकला था, एक ऐड निकला था जिसमें ये लिखा था कि एक हैप्पीनेस करिकुलम है, हमें बच्चों को स्ट्रेस फ्री कैसे रह सकते हैं, क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग कैसे सिखा सकते हैं, अच्छे रिलेशनशिप्स कैसे बन सकते हैं, इन सब के बारे में बातचीत करनी है। तो उस समय मैं अपनी संस्था चला रही थी लभ्य, और हमने कहा कि कुछ मिलता जुलता तो कर रहे हैं, हम बहुत छोटे थे बट हमें लगा कि चलिए देखते हैं कि क्या कर सकते हैं, और हमने अप्लाई किया। और फिर हमें पता चला कि करीब 1800 प्रपोजल्स और इनविटेशंस में से करीब 13 ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस को शॉर्टलिस्ट किया गया था। उनमें से हम भी एक थे, थैंकफुली, जो इस पे कुछ आसपास बात कर रहे थे, सोशल इमोशनल वेल बीइंग, लाइफ स्किल्स पर। और हमें सर के सामने अपना काम प्रोजेक्ट करने का मौका मिला, शेयर करने का मौका मिला, और फिर अंत में 5 संस्थाएं मिलकर आईं जो एक कंसोर्शियम बन के जिन्होंने हैप्पीनेस करिकुलम को सरकार के साथ और जो हमारे बहुत ही अमेजिंग टीचर्स हैं उनके साथ मिल कर के बनाने में जुड़े। तो दैट्स हाउ आई मेट सर, एंड देन सिंस देन ही इज़ बिन गाइडिंग अस थ्रू एंड थ्रू।
बहुत सारे लोग ना अच्छा काम कर रहे हैं देश में, पर वो इंडिविजुअल्स हैं, छोटे छोटे ग्रुप हैं, उनकी अपनी लिमिटेशंस हैं। 10 लोग मिलके कर रहे हैं तो अच्छा कर रहे हैं और पूरा जोर लगा के कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उसकी सीमा है। 10 लोग मिलके जो करेंगे उसकी एक दायरा है। 24 घंटे भी लगाएंगे पर कितना हो पाएगा। अब सोचो हमारे पास 18 लाख बच्चे हैं स्कूलों में, और दिल्ली में, पूरे देश में देखें तो करोड़ों बच्चे हैं स्कूलों में पढ़ते हैं। तो छोटे छोटे प्रयास जो पूरे देश में हो रहे हैं उनको क्लब कर दें और उनको स्कूलों में ले आएं और उनको एक साथ ले आएं। तो ये मेरा काम था। अच्छा काम इनका काम, अच्छा काम करना इनका काम था, अच्छे काम को स्कूल तक लाना मेरा काम था, आप तक लाना मेरा काम था।
थैंक यू सर। एक सवाल है कि व्हाई एवरी डे एंड व्हाई ऑल स्कूल्स?
देखो, स्कूल में एक होती है कुछ हमारी विशफुल थिंकिंग्स होती हैं पढ़ाने में, और कुछ हमारी मेन कोर्स होते हैं। तो फिज़िक्स मेन कोर्स होगा, केमिस्ट्री, मैथमेटिक्स, लैंग्वेज, ह्यूमैनिटी के और जो सब्जेक्ट हैं, हिस्ट्री को जानना समझना, ज्योग्राफी को, ये सब मेन कोर्स हैं। पर हैप्पीनेस मेन कोर्स क्यों नहीं है भाई? हैप्पीनेस साइड कोर्स कैसे होगा? तो जबकि हम जिसको भी चाहें, चाहे कोई IAS अफसर बने, चाहे बिजनेसमैन बने, चाहे वकील बने, पत्रकार बने, लेकिन हर एक आदमी को हैप्पी होना चाहिए। इंजीनियर, डॉक्टर बने, उसको हैप्पी होना चाहिए। तो हैप्पीनेस तो सब में कॉमन है, कॉमन रिक्वायर्ड है। तो अगर हम इतने स्केल पे नहीं करेंगे, अगर हमको लग रहा है कि रोज़ाना साइंस नहीं पढ़ाई तो साइंटिस्ट नहीं बनेगा, अगर हमने रोज़ाना हिस्ट्री नहीं पढ़ाई तो उसको हिस्ट्री की पूरी समझ नहीं बनेगी, तो रोज़ाना हैप्पीनेस नहीं पढ़ाएंगे ना, तो ज़िंदगी में हैप्पीनेस भी नहीं समझ में आएगा।
थैंक यू फॉर शेयरिंग दैट। और एक और, अब हैप्पीनेस करिकुलम को 4 साल होने वाले हैं इस साल। व्हाट इज़ द फ्यूचर? हाउ डू यू सी दिस शेपिंग अप? एंड मोर इम्पॉर्टेंटली, हाउ डू यू लुक एट द असेसमेंट ऑफ सच अ माइंडसेट ड्रिवन प्रोग्राम?
फ्यूचर तो ये है कि हर बच्चा अब हैप्पीनेस का एम्बेसडर बने, क्योंकि उसको स्कूल में हैप्पीनेस की क्लास दी जा रही है, रोज़ाना वो हैप्पीनेस सीख रहा है। तो जैसे मतलब मैं हर चीज़ को साइंस के साथ कोरिलेट करता हूँ। एक बार जब बच्चा समझ लेता है कि ये जो है हमारा कुछ बॉडी है या जो भी सॉलिड हम अपने आसपास देखते हैं, वो अल्टीमेटली मतलब छोटे छोटे एटम्स में है, इलेक्ट्रॉन, न्यूट्रॉन, प्रोटॉन में, जितना भी वो जान पाता है उतना, तो उसको फिर कोई ये नहीं समझा सकता कि ये सब एक है। सब समझ जाएगा छोटे छोटे टुकड़े टुकड़े और टुकड़े के टुकड़े टुकड़े हो सकते हैं। वो किसी को भी समझा सकता है, पढ़े लिखे को या अनपढ़ को। तो वैसे ही मैं चाहता हूँ कि हैप्पीनेस को भी हमारा हर एक बच्चा समझे, और घर में जाके माँ बाप को, घर में जाके अपने फैमिली के और मेंबर्स को, अपने अड़ोसी पड़ोस सबको समझाए कि देखो हम कहाँ गलत कर रहे हैं, हमारी सोच कहाँ गलत है, हमारे रिएक्शंस कहाँ गलत हैं, हमारे इमोशंस कैसे गलत दिशा में चले जाते हैं। तो ये सारी चीज़ें अब आप सोच के देखिए कि गवर्नमेंट स्कूलों के 18 लाख बच्चे हैं। अगर ये 18 लाख बच्चे सोसाइटी में एम्बेसडर का काम करने लगें, हैप्पीनेस एम्बेसडर का काम करने लगें, तो कितना कमाल हो जाएगा। आपने इसके बारे में पूछा इवैल्यूएशन इसका कि भाई इसको कैसे समझें कि ये ठीक चल रहा है कि नहीं चल रहा। कुल मिला के इवैल्यूएशन का ये है। 2 साल पूरी दुनिया ने पेंडेमिक देखा है और दिल्ली तो वन ऑफ द वर्स्ट मतलब अफेक्टेड एरियाज़ में से रहा है। 2 साल अपने आप में टेस्ट पीरियड ही था। इसका टेस्ट आप हैप्पीनेस का किसी 3 घंटे के एग्ज़ाम में बिठा के नहीं ले सकते। कोविड की महामारी के समय में बच्चे जब घर में बैठे उस वक्त उन्होंने कैसे बिहेव किया, अपनी एंग्जाइटी से कैसे निकले, अपने घर में के वातावरण में कैसे कोप अप किया, पढ़ाई को, स्ट्रेस को, बहुत सारे परिवारों में बहुत स्ट्रेस के घटनाएं घटी, उन सब को कैसे उन्होंने कोप अप किया, ये उसका रियल टेस्ट था। एंड आई एम प्राउड टू से कि जिन बच्चों ने हैप्पीनेस की क्लास की थी उन बच्चों ने अपनी फैमिली में बहुत अच्छे से बिहेव किया। घर में कोई ऐसी घटना घटी उस पर बहुत अच्छे से मैच्योर तरीके से एक समझदार बच्चे को जिसको आता है कुछ अपनी नॉलेज को यूज़ करना, अपनी समझ, उस तरह से बिहेव किया और अपनी पढ़ाई को कंटिन्यू रखा। तो वो असली टेस्ट था और मैं देखता हूँ कि हमारे बच्चे इस टेस्ट में पास हुए हैं, बाय डिफ़ॉल्ट पास हुए हैं।
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sisodia, Richa, Arzu, and the whole team for sharing a bit of your story with us. Next, we are taking a trip to South Africa, where we will hear from Dr. Komane Mphahlele, the Deputy Director General of Curriculum Management and Delivery at Limpopo Province Department of Education. Dr. Mphahlele is going to share a bit more about this reform and the impact it has had on teachers and learners in South Africa.
We thought we would start this conversation with some personal stories. And I was wondering if you could share your own experience with social and emotional learning in your school. And do you feel that it was a big part of your education growing up?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It is indeed very exciting to be part of this conversation, especially now in the 21st century, and more specifically during COVID-19 pandemic. I will share with you my personal story, but also what we have done in education regarding SEL. I have grown up in a culture that is underpinned by a philosophy called Boto. And we also have Nguni languages, they call it Ubuntu. Basically, it's at the center of human life. I am because you are because I am. And that, I think, it's at the heart. I'm using heart, not brain, of our living. So when every morning when you wake up and you are greeted by somebody in the family, they will use in a Sotho language, my home language, in English says the night is a lion. When you wake up, greet each other, because the lion might have swallowed you during the night. So it means we must check each other every time you wake up in the morning, because you don't know what would have happened during the night to that person. And when you greet that person, we're saying, it means all the information is in your face. So when I greet you, I'm having a look at you in your eyes. Are you smiling? Are you sad? What's wrong with you? So that is, I think, very important. If we lose it, we're going to use what you call this SEL, the social and emotional aspect of our being. You know, with the schooling evolving into a modern society, what took over was rational thinking. Anything that makes sense rationally is the one that is dominant in the schooling system and in our lives. The courses are using rational thinking, for example. So emotional thinking has been, excluded from society. So there's no emotional thinking at all. So in our case, the heart is at the center. For example, I'm in Limpopo now, province of South Africa. And in every letterhead, there's a footnote. It says we are the heartland of Southern Africa. It doesn't say we are the brain. So it's not a mistake, because Ubuntu, Boto, has a trinity, relies on Trinity. Trinity is the heart, the body, and the spiritual soul. But in a modern Western philosophy, civilization, mind, body, and soul, the mind, body, and soul. With us, it's not the mind, it's the heart, body, and soul. So that is the bringing, my upbringing, and the philosophy, especially sub-Saharan Africa, subscribes to that philosophy of Ubuntu. There's no English word for it, but some scholars who are learned crafted, one of them, Eskia, gave it an English name. He called it African humanism. He tried to explain it to the English world, this philosophy. And it's just that now, mainly it is practiced in communities, in villages, but then this person who grew up in the villages goes into a schooling system which excludes this. And now it means there's a dichotomy. And then in the schooling system, once you lose it, you lose that social glue that holds the community together. And so what happened in the education system, we realized that it is important to integrate this into the curriculum. So in 1994, when we now had first democratic elections, we developed the new curriculum. The first phase of the curriculum, first iteration, was called Curriculum 2005. The idea was to roll it out into the schooling system by 2005, hence the label Curriculum 2005. But then it was reviewed in 1999, around 2000. When it was reviewed, we thought this is the right time now to integrate what we call indigenous knowledge systems into the curriculum. So that has been accepted. And now we have a principle called valuing indigenous knowledge systems, meaning that in the schooling system, we can now embrace this philosophy of Boto, Ubuntu. I am because you are because I am. And if you are traveled, I'm traveled. If I'm traveled, you are traveled. And we must restore that equilibrium together.
How did you first got involved in policy discussions, and how you started your interest in developing and implementing social and emotional learning processes?
I have been fortunate to participate in the curriculum change process way back in the 90s. So when at a political level, there was a change from a system that promoted segregation into a system, a democratic system. We on the education side were also grappling with how to unify different education systems that promoted segregation on the basis of either ethnicity, religion, or race. And when we're doing this, we started to grapple with what principles must underpin the new education system and the curriculum that will give expression to these principles. And I have been fortunate to participate in all of those iterations up to today, from the early 90s up to today. Even before 1994, we were already involved in a very simple project at the time of cleansing. We call them syllabuses of racist overtones. And then after 1994, we then had a constitution that espoused human rights and as well as a democratic and inclusive society, inclusive. so that we could appreciate difference and not loathe it and see it as a negative. And as I indicated, in participating in the new curriculum, we had to grapple, how do we package the new curriculum? And in packaging it, what do we include? And so the issue of life skills, life orientation came to the fore. And we agreed for the first time in the history of South Africa that that is where we should locate, not solely, but exclusively, but it should be the subject that drives emotional, social, physical, competences that anyone will need to work in a democratic society, in an inclusive society. Obviously, one subject is not enough to do that because the principles cut across, but that is where you'll find the expression around me and myself, me and my community, me and society as a whole, me and my career. So that is where life skills in the foundation phase, the first 4 years of the schooling system, life skills and early knowledge, and then thereafter life orientation from grade 4 up to grade 12. So that is the subject that I think South Africa has given, where it gave expression to matters around SEL. And this has become it came very handy during COVID, as we were dealing with COVID, and say, all right, now there is this general knowledge from the World Health Organization around COVID. We're following it every day, but who's going to take it up in the schooling system? How do we teach it? Do we just leave it? Every teacher will Google some information and share with learners. And we found that life orientation was the best place. And therefore, the life orientation teachers became the vanguard. The life orientation became the facilitators of knowledge and educating their learners, their parents in the school governing bodies, the teachers, the managers around life orientation. And they developed it was called COVID-19 Orientation Guide, which was developed centrally and it was approved formally. It met certain standards and make sure it is rigorous, and the training, they conducted training of facilitators so that there is quality and rigor in the way you expose learners to the pandemic. And the same happened with HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS education in the schooling system was driven through life orientation. And so whenever the social fabric of society is disturbed, and therefore the teachers of life orientation are now better placed to assist in gluing, bringing the glue back, the social glue back, and using life orientation as a subject.
What are the current needs in this moment in your educational context that SEL, social and emotional learning, could help address?
The demand is great, is higher, especially during the COVID. It exposed urgent need to deal with SEL matters. We found now that the time we've allocated to life orientation in the school calendar is very little. I mean, there is a great demand now for psychosocial support. And COVID-19 has exposed this very clearly, that psychosocial support is needed more than ever before in the history of our education system. And psychosocial support, not just for learners, psychosocial support for teachers, psychosocial support for managers, psychosocial support for parents. So meaning that you also need to draw on the expertise not only from educators alone, but from psychologists, from social workers, and so on. And currently now, last week on Thursday, the two MECs, these are the political heads of education and social development, last week have addressed a function where we are now taking the ECD function from social development to education. As we do so, we are now bringing under one umbrella the early childhood development. That's where we will need to develop very early these emotional competences, social competences under the education umbrella. So by the time they start formal schooling, they're well developed. And in doing so and bringing the function from social development to education, we also were bringing the expertise in the form of social workers who are also coming into the education space. And that is an added resource that we desperately need. And this will be distributed and placed in the district offices. In the district offices, they'll be able to now provide psychosocial support to schools. We are now seeing an increase in the number of bullying incidences, for example. It's so terrible when you see, and some of them even taking their lives because they were bullied and they are psychological, they were so affected that they saw the only option is to take their lives, meaning we now need more than ever before to promote SEL in our education system and making sure that we have equipped people to deal with that.
What are the changes you've seen so far in students, teachers, stakeholders since you started implementing SEL policies until now? What is the major change in the behaviors you've seen?
When we started introducing the new curriculum and also the new subject called life orientation, it was not there before 94. So in the colleges that trained teachers, they didn't have this as a subject. So what it meant is that after 94, we're introducing a subject, but the teachers were not trained in. But because there was a desperate need for it, we had to bring it into the system as a subject and then use the available resource that is there, the existing teachers, and retrain them in making sure that they can now be life orientation teachers, life skills teachers. I think, and it's only now we're beginning to see that it is now accepted that it is an important subject. But also in terms of weighting, it is the only subject that has 75% school-based assessment weight. Others are having 25%. So this is the only subject that carries 75% school-based assessment weight from primary up to secondary school, grade 12, and also the time. And this is, I think, an area that even when universities are looking for accepting learners into universities, they do not see it as an important subject. It's not carrying a weight. You know, what carries weight are the others, cognitive subjects that deal with but this one is not carrying that weight. And if we don't prioritize it and give it weight so that anyone who's coming out of either the schooling system or the university system, having developed social and emotional competences, it will continue to force us to react whenever there is a crisis or a pandemic. But we need to be proactive. We need to move ahead. And I think that's why you're prioritizing SEL. I'm sure that's why you're saying remove it from the wardrobe, from the cupboards, under the table. Let's put it, let's foreground it. Let's be proactive. We don't want to be reacting all the time to crisis. We need to be proactive. And by being proactive, we are now preventing, because prevention is better than cure. We are now preventing future crises. And I think that is where I think we should be focusing our energies on.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And I completely agree with this idea of SEL for developing resilience in societies.
Thank you, Dr. Mphahlele. If you are interested in learning more about the curriculum reform in South Africa and its implications, you can watch the full interview on our YouTube channel right after this. Next, we are going to hear from another selected social and emotional learning innovator, Daniela Labra, the Director General of Atentamente and Educating for Wellbeing Senior Instructor, who sat down with Sofialeticia Morales, Secretary of Education for the state of Nuevo León in Mexico. Educating for Wellbeing trains educators to improve their own social and emotional competencies in order to better help foster SEL in students and implement systemic change. In this clip, Daniela and Sofialeticia discuss how they were able to come together and implement a social and emotional learning program in a time of crisis after a devastating earthquake rocketed the region in 2017.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Sofialeticia Morales, secretaria de Educación del Estado de Nuevo León, por estar aquí con nosotros para este video, para HundrED y sobre la innovación educativa de Educar para el Bienestar que estás promoviendo como educación socioemocional para Nuevo León.
Me parece excelente.
Sí.
Y un agradecimiento a HundrED también por hacer esta iniciativa que nos va a permitir aprender unos de otros.
Y la siguiente pregunta es, ¿cómo te involucraste tú por primera vez en los debates de la política pública sobre la aplicación del programa de aprendizaje socioemocional?
Primero que todo, sí fue un tema central. Yo tuve el privilegio de ser parte del equipo de la Secretaría de Educación Pública que puso en el centro del nuevo modelo educativo la educación socioemocional. También quiero decir que coincide con otro elemento fundamental. El 17 de septiembre del 2017 tenemos otro de los grandes sismos en la Ciudad de México, y en ese sismo uno de los elementos que más se lastimó tanto en su infraestructura como en su dinámica fueron las escuelas. Y ahí yo tuve la fortuna de trabajar conjuntamente con uno de los padres de la educación de emergencia, de la pedagogía de la emergencia, que es Ben Ruth. Él ha podido, abrevando de la metodología Waldorf, crear una pedagogía de la emergencia, y la ha probado con distintas poblaciones después de las grandes catástrofes o humanas como guerras o desastres naturales, y en este caso era un desastre natural que era el sismo que había que trabajar. Y la pedagogía de la emergencia parte también de que después de una catástrofe tenemos heridas anímicas y que hay que poner atención, y que la educación artística y la educación física juegan un papel fundamental para sacar esa angustia que provocó una catástrofe. Pero sí tengo que decir que el elemento formativo central en los maestros y maestras de la Ciudad de México fue contigo en Atentamente, porque era quien lo tenía, además de estarlo trabajando como expertos, lo tenía muy claramente identificado cómo trabajar con los maestros para que estos trabajen con los alumnos. Con el ABCD, que en otro momento, pero digamos, ¿cuáles son esos pasos? Empezando por poner atención en nosotros mismos, por aceptar que la bondad es un elemento, y aquí ese cruce con esta tradición, digamos, religiosa y espiritual, pero sí la bondad como un elemento de educación socioemocional, y la claridad y la dirección de nuestros sentimientos y de nuestra acción. Entonces, creo que esos con elementos claves nos ayudaron mucho. También tengo que reconocer que la Universidad Iberoamericana apoyó mucho en ese proceso de formación. Con toda la influencia desde España, porque ustedes tienen de la Universidad de Wisconsin, con toda la experiencia de la red de escuelas resilientes y toda esta visión de cómo trabajarlo como escuela. Y luego también con Mark Brackett, toda esta idea también utiliza un acrónimo que es RULER. Cómo de alguna manera regulamos nuestros sentimientos y los vamos orientando. Y eso pues ha sido, digamos, mi experiencia teórica, pero también en la aplicación, en distintos niveles educativos.
Nosotros, en efecto, ¿dónde empezamos a insertarnos? Cuando surgió atentamente, como que fue muy claro que esta idea de el bienestar como una meta de la educación y como algo integral, ¿no? Y el desarrollo de estas competencias, ¿no? Como tú dices, de que te provean o te fortalezcan de autoconocimiento, de esta relación más armónica con los demás, más empática, bondadosa. Para nosotros era muy claro desde el principio, al pensar en atentamente, que teníamos que movernos no solo con los niños, con los docentes, como nuestra teoría de cambio se basa en el adulto como modelo para los niños, pero también decíamos, tenemos que hablar de política pública, ¿no? Esto no se va a hacer como, bueno, puedes empezar, pero de uno a uno, ¿cómo hacer un cambio en la cultura? Que es un poco lo que nosotros decimos. Me acuerdo que en el 2012 vino el doctor Richard Davidson, lo llevamos al Congreso y entonces estuvo hablando ahí en el Congreso de la Unión en la Ciudad de México sobre este tema. Y para nosotros era un tema, obviamente, pero es cuando ustedes, desde la Secretaría Federal, hacen, ¿no? Meten como obligatoria la educación socioemocional y nos invitan a ser parte de ese grupo de expertos para el desarrollo global de la currícula. Y eso pues fue un gran privilegio, un momento con la Iberoamericana, con gente aquí de Vía Educación, ¿no? De aquí mismo en Monterrey. Y se hizo, entonces nosotros participamos ahí y de ahí después participamos en Constrúyete, haciendo la currícula e implementando. Y esa fue la parte también muy linda de trabajar directamente con los docentes en toda la República y contigo en la Ciudad de México. Pero esta idea de poder trabajar con personas como tú, como aquel equipo, con esa visión, ¿no? Pues se vuelve lo que para nosotros articula la posibilidad de llegar así más masivamente, ¿no? Diciendo cómo transformamos esto en todas las escuelas, en los municipios, en todo el país. Entonces ahí fue como nos metimos y gracias a esos espacios que ustedes también nos permitieron y creyeron en nosotros y con la Iberoamericana, como decías, que estuvimos trabajando, eso fue cuando como entramos y después hemos tenido el privilegio de trabajar con algunos secretarios o secretarias a nivel estatal, ¿no? Que también han asumido, como tú dices, esta bandera. Entonces, cuando hay esa claridad desde la cabeza, pues hay una transformación, ¿no? Hay una posibilidad mucho mayor.
A veces es necesario, y uno tiene que ver pros y contras, una crisis, una catástrofe, para que uno ponga en el centro el verdadero sentido de la educación socioemocional. Y nosotros la vivimos en la Ciudad de México con el sismo. Y la pedagogía de la emergencia juega un papel muy importante en curar esas heridas anímicas a corto plazo. Pero también la claridad de que los aprendizajes fundamentales, que es el primer escalón para seguir aprendiendo, que es la comprensión lectora, la capacidad de expresar y expresar su visión y su experiencia, obviamente el pensamiento científico y como aprendizaje fundamental la inteligencia y la educación socioemocional. La inteligencia socioemocional y la educación socioemocional. Tiene que estar como en el centro. Y aquí yo creo que por eso digo que tuve ese privilegio, porque se estaba discutiendo en una mesa del diseño del currículo. Tuvimos obviamente este desastre natural, pero que también nos quitó el tapete y nos dijo, ¿qué tanto estamos cuidando la educación socioemocional? Y la fortuna de que ustedes estaban trabajando en esa mesa, conjuntamente con, como tú lo dices, con la Ibero, con Vía Educación, y que precisamente quien coordinaba esto me dijo, yo estaba buscando alternativas para seguir, no con la pedagogía de la emergencia, sino con la educación socioemocional. Y dijo, bueno, cualquiera de ellas te puede ayudar, y hablé con cada uno. Y lo que encontré es que atentamente ustedes tenían esa claridad que no es fácil entre un pensamiento, digamos, más académico para construir algo y habilidades concretas para trabajar con los maestros de educación básica, que era en ese momento el compromiso que yo tenía desde la Ciudad de México, era solo hasta educación básica. Ahora tengo el privilegio de poder influir hasta educación media superior y hasta, en las universidades públicas hasta la educación superior. Entonces, es mucho más el compromiso de decir cómo hacemos que el centro, que el pegamento de los aprendizajes fundamentales sea siempre la educación socioemocional. La educación socioemocional tiene que ser así, tiene que partir de la voluntad del maestro frente al salón, que está viendo esas necesidades de los niños y las niñas. Y aquí me gustaría comentarte una anécdota. Cuando entramos, como te decía en la pregunta anterior, con mucha fuerza con la pedagogía de la emergencia, porque estábamos en emergencia. Cuando nosotros entramos a la responsabilidad como secretaria de Educación, solo el 3% de las escuelas estaba abierta. Y la mayoría de ese 3% eran colegios particulares que tenían las condiciones para seguir con una educación remota. Para diciembre yo ya tenía 95% de las escuelas abiertas. Entonces era muy importante este tema de transitar de la pedagogía del miedo a la pedagogía de la esperanza, pero cuando se dio esta conferencia de la pedagogía de la emergencia, yo me daba cuenta que los maestros escribían y escribían en el chat y me puse a leerlo y la mayoría decía, sí, nos parece perfecto cuidar las heridas anímicas de los alumnos, pero ¿quién nos va a cuidar a nosotros? ¿Cómo me cuido yo? ¿Cómo me sano yo? Y ahí obviamente fue la clave para decir, hay que empezar con los maestros y con ellos mismos, porque ellos son la figura de transformación y hay que empezar desde las escuelas. Y es cuando te llamo y te digo, a ver, ¿cómo me ayudas en esto para darle continuidad? Tenía mucha claridad en que la educación socioemocional tenía que ser el centro de los aprendizajes fundamentales, pero ¿cómo la hacemos para que se construya de abajo hacia arriba? Y por eso lo ligo con esta idea del contrato social que realmente se va construyendo desde las escuelas, que además es el espacio privilegiado para ese proceso de interacción, de convivencia, de educación socioemocional. Y entonces, ¿cómo te contesto más brevemente? Pues los grandes, digamos, cómplices en esta tarea, además de ustedes, han sido los supervisores, los directores, los asesores técnico-pedagógicos, los jefes de sector, los maestros y maestras frente a grupo y sobre todo los niños, niñas, adolescentes y jóvenes.
Y acá otra pregunta es, ¿cuál ha sido, crees, el principal logro en este proceso?
Es muy ambicioso hablar de logros, pero yo sí hablaría de procesos. Primero, el tener muy claro que la educación socioemocional tenía que ser el punto de despegue desde la primera semana de entrar, invitando a todos los actores, todas las figuras educativas. Segundo, el poder ofrecer primero escuchar a los maestros, que me parece fundamental, y decir, necesitamos actuar ya. Y la actuación inmediata fue ofrecer un taller negociado con ustedes, que ustedes nos dan, pero un taller abierto a todas las figuras educativas. Más de 5,100 maestros o figuras educativas, que va desde el supervisor hasta el maestro frente a grupo, se inscribieron emocionados y pudimos realmente empezar con la emoción de decir, sí hay una respuesta a mi petición de quién me ayuda, quién me ayuda a sanar mis heridas anímicas, pero también me da las herramientas para trabajarlo en la escuela. Y eso yo creo que ha sido un gran acierto por escuchar, por responder inmediatamente y por la respuesta de los maestros, porque 5,100 figuras educativas que dicen, levantan la mano y dicen, yo sí quiero tomar un taller centrado en el bienestar socioemocional y en el bienestar mío para poder pasar ese bienestar.
Creo que eso es un logro enorme para un país, ¿no? Donde hay una sensibilización, donde se habla de ello. Creo que en general el país todavía no está muy articulado, yo creo, en la realidad concreta de las escuelas. porque requiere este tipo de estrategia puntual como tú estás haciendo. Sí hemos notado, como tú muy bien señalas, este aumento en los problemas mentales de todo mundo, desde los chiquitines hasta, por supuesto, los adultos, todos responsables. Y entonces también se hizo muy evidente, ¿no? O sea, ya muy palpable. Requiero herramientas para trabajar con esto. No estábamos preparados para ese aislamiento, no estábamos preparados para la angustia, para la dificultad. Y eso es parte de las habilidades socioemocionales y lo que intentamos, ¿no? Es como con esa pedagogía, o sea, te ayuda cuando está la dificultad, pero te prepara, ¿no? O sea, te hace más resiliente en general hacia el futuro.
Que yo creo que algo que nos dio la pandemia positivo, y yo quisiera ponerlo, es el realmente valorar lo que tenemos siempre y no lo habíamos valorado, como el valor de la escuela, pero sobre todo de la interacción y la dinámica de la escuela en los niños y las niñas. Llegan los niños, los primeros que los llevaban a preescolar el primer día con una cara de felicidad, de decir, ya quiero regresar a mi escuela. Desgraciadamente, como decía, pues con estos vaivenes de distintas cepas, pues tenemos también que ir aprendiendo cómo logramos que no se pierda, que vean en las escuelas como un referente de que aquí está abierta con esos ABCD, con los brazos abiertos, con esta visión de bondad, de atención, de claridad y de dirección.
Pues muchísimas gracias y muchísimo éxito y se abran todas las puertas de todo lo que tú estás visualizando y con tú y con los demás. Muchas gracias, Sofialeticia.
Thank you, Daniela and Sofialeticia, for sharing some of your experience with us. We so often forget that teachers too need support when it comes to building their social and emotional competencies. I know our HundrED research team has a lot to say on this topic. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our Head of Research, Crystal Green, and our Education Specialist, Clara Garcia Millan, who are going to give you a peek inside of our new report focused on the implementation of social and emotional learning in education policy.
Thank you, Mariah. It has been a pleasure to team up with the Labhya Foundation once again and take one step forward in our research process and translate the showcase of SEL innovations from our previous report to something that policymakers could use. So I'm sitting here with Crystal, with our head of research, and my first question for you is, why a policy report?
Thanks, Clara. Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I think we've been thinking about why a policy report from the perspective of what is it that policymakers want. And maybe there are a lot of things, but I think one of the primary things is evidence, right? We'd like to have evidence-based policy. And there are a couple kinds of evidence that we can give. One is scientific research, and I think something that we're elaborating in this report specifically are the kinds of evidence that our innovators have produced to show that their innovations are working. A lot of them are collaborating with universities and research institutions to do all kinds of research to show how their innovations work. But the second thing, besides scientific research, is also practice, to show evidence through practice. And that's also what we're trying to give in this report.
So we are talking here about bringing evidence from the practice to the policy. So my next question for you is, what is the relationship between SEL policy and change in education?
I think part of this question just has to do with how does policy in general make change in education. One of those is to think about policy as a vehicle for systems reform. So how is it that making a government policy, a national policy, even a state policy or a policy at any level, how does that make change? How does the government make change when we think about policy in those terms? So the other way to think about this, policy as the politics of decision making. So we're thinking about resource allocation and how it is that these wider government structures or non-governmental organizations are creating documents, mandates, commitments that then articulate how it is that resources should be allocated, in this case specifically for SEL and education. So then you're thinking about the role of organizations like UNICEF or UNESCO or the OECD, even the World Bank, and the kind of political documents or policy documents that they are putting out that give an indication of how it is that resources could be and should be allocated towards social and emotional learning.
That's a very interesting point. Actually, what we've been seeing with our 13 selected innovations is that if they were able to pilot their project, if they were able to create the infrastructure to implement this SEL project and even monitor and evaluate their process to then iterate it, is because there was funding channeled towards these kind of projects. And this means that there's foundations, governments, different institutions interested in funding SEL projects. So my next question for you is, why do foundations, governments, and other institutions integrate SEL as a policy mandate? Why are they interested in investing in this kind of projects?
Yeah. So I think that this question about why a policy for SEL and why are these foundations making those mandates, or why are they making those commitments? First of all, it just has to do with, again, the role of policy generally. Policy is a support for action. So anytime you have kind of a government document where teachers, school leaders can kind of reference that and say, oh, well, look, here we have the mandate that we need to do this. That creates a space in the system where then teachers, innovators can put time and energy and resources into doing social emotional learning, because they kind of have the basis there, the rationale before it in the policy. The other is, in terms of SEL research specifically, we see a growth in these policies around social and emotional learning in combination with a growth in the research about social and emotional learning. So we have more evidence now that social and emotional learning leads to improved outcomes for students, and you're starting to see that reflected in local, state, national, and international policy movements. But the other piece of research is that we're starting to understand better actually not only the sort of outcomes-based, but also understanding learning better. What is the relationship between cognitive function and affect and socialization? Our understanding of that is improving, but the way schools are organized doesn't necessarily reflect that still. So this is another piece of how education policy changing is also kind of laying the foundation for there to be system reform in education. So these first two things are about the sort of bolstering the policy rationale, the reasons for why it is that we're doing social emotional learning in schools. But the third thing is policy, again, gives a space for there to be funding. It gives a space for there to be, more specifically, resource allocation. And that's something that is really important. It's been really important for all of our innovators. You can see that they have had support from governments, but especially that they've had support from partners and foundations to give them the space to innovate, to try something new, to do pilot programs in different places, and those have always been really well supported by the commitments of different foundations. And I think that then opens this question for policymakers of how is it that we can make innovation more sustainable within the public system when we currently have, at least for the innovators that we have highlighted, a situation in which it is often the case that these innovations come out of the private sector, or they come out of incubators or something like that, and then only after that, then there's the possibility to take it into public education, and then not necessarily with like a strong sort of financial foundation for how to continue the innovation in that way. So to me, that's still an open question after this, is how is it that the public system can create the space for innovation to happen?
That was a very interesting point, Crystal, and actually it reminds me to some of the cases we've seen in this report, and we just heard from this implementation story from Mexico, and this is the perfect example of an innovation that started its development outside the public system through foundations, and slowly it started this dialogue with the governments, and it reached the point in which the innovation is sustainable because they got this partnership with the government. So here we can see the importance of these innovations partnering with the government. I would recommend anyone here to go visit our report, our policy report, in which we explore a bit further how these connections between the innovations, the governments, the funders are working and how they are implementing SEL at scale. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to partner once again with the LEGO Foundation and work together in our shared goal of fostering education innovation in the field of SEL, and especially with this report promote SEL policy for a better impact in our education systems. Back to you, Mariah.
If we have learned anything from today, is that there are remarkable practices being implemented at scale around the world. From policymakers championing social and emotional learning, to innovators working closely with ministries of education, offering quality social and emotional learning to help all children to thrive is no longer a dream, but a reality. We are seeing it happen in a variety of contexts globally right now. Our hope for this event is that it can be a source of inspiration for policymakers globally, as well as the education community at large, to place social and emotional learning at the forefront when discussing the future of education and what students need right now. We can no longer talk about education without including arguably the key stakeholder, students. So with that, a huge thank you to everyone for joining today. We have included all of the relevant links below, and a huge thanks to our partners at the Labhya Foundation for making this possible. We see this as part of a larger conversation and look forward to continuing this discussion with the global education community. Now, over to our youth ambassadors to close us out.
I'm Perrin, a Filipino HundrED youth ambassador from Saudi Arabia. A week isn't enough time to start an educational revolution, but given the chance, I would focus on engaging students, promoting project-based learning across multiple subjects. When a class learns through innovative projects, they're the ones actively seeking information and making connections by themselves. This will give them the feeling of wanting to know more, instead of having the feeling that another person is trying to stuff a book inside your head.
Namaste everyone. I'm a HundrED youth ambassador all the way from India. My name is Apurva Singh, and what I would do if I were the education minister for my country, India, for 1 week is raise the salary of teachers and also change the boards to IB, since IB enhances creativity in children that many of the boards in India don't do. That's it. Thank you everyone. Adios. Namaste.
Hi, I'm Shusin, a HundrED Youth Ambassador from Malaysia. This year, I hope to be more proactive in classrooms. I used to be shy to share my opinions and answers in class because I'm afraid that I might embarrass myself if I get a certain question wrong or I just simply spitted out wrong facts. But this year, I hope to be more courageous and treat the classroom as a place to learn and grow without fearing mistakes and failures.
I want to focus on for myself this year is to embrace the change that is happening with my body. So due to a growth spurt, I've been gaining weight and also getting more taller, and the people around me have been commenting on my weight gain. So one thing that I want to focus on is feeling positive and accepting this change wholeheartedly, and not only stopping here but also empowering and raising awareness around such effects on young girls through my social development initiative.